Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. This is part of my work that I've been doing since 2014 in conjunction with my fellowship and at University of North Carolina. This is just the outline for what I'm going to be talking today. I will discuss just the general basic information about ocean circulation and what people have been doing so far with respect to energy sources in the ocean. Then I will give a quick overview of the energy terms in the ocean and especially the exchanges between kinetic and available potential energy. Then I will discuss my simulations that I have been doing, and I have been, for my simulations, focusing on this part of the ocean. So it's an idealized model of the Southern Ocean, and I will talk about why I'm in particular focusing on this part, and then give you some brief overview of my results and what I will be doing next. I think many of you have seen this thermohaline circulation plot a lot. So you have colder water forming at the poles that sinks, and then it ends up getting, as it sinks, getting transferred further down and then all around the globe. But a lot of the question is, well, what is really affecting it? Is it only forming because of the buoyancy forcing at the poles, or is the wind playing any role in this? And what's going to happen if the wind or buoyancy forcing or any of this changes in the future? And why we're really interested in any of the mixing is because ocean in general is vertically stratified. So you have this top layer that has a lot more oxygen because of the exchange with the atmosphere, and it has more light. But then you have the steep pycnocline, so the region where you have rapid change in density, and then a very large so-called abyssal ocean where you have a lot of nutrients generated from decomposition. And most of the flow in the ocean is along surfaces of constant density, but what people are really interested is in how much of the exchange goes across this pycnocline and across the surfaces of constant density. And one of the reasons we care about it is, for a biological point of view, you want to see how much nutrients are coming up to basically sustain life at the surface where you have a lot more light and oxygen. And then also how much of that is going down to get decomposed at the surface. Another reason we care about it is for CO2 sequestration. So if you have, what we really care about is how much of this carbon dioxide from the surface, from the atmospheric interaction, is going into the abyssal ocean, where it will stay, hopefully, and not come back up. So some of the important terms for the energy in the ocean: you have kinetic energy, which is generally generated by surface winds, and also can be generated by tides, both lunar tides and also internal waves and tides. And so to contrast with the kinetic energy, you have available potential energy, which is generated by buoyancy flux through differential heating and cooling, and also evaporation and precipitation at the surface. So this is how basically the change of density at the ocean surface. And what we're really interested is in the vertical buoyancy flux. So this is the exchange between the kinetic energy and potential energy. And it's positive if you are either lifting up dense fluid or lowering light fluid. So you're generating potential energy. So that's the amount that will either, if you raise a dense fluid, it has potential to come back down, or if you lower light fluid, it has potential to bounce back up. And it's negative if the opposite is true. So you're getting transfer from potential energy back to kinetic energy. And for our work, we are looking at this complicated ocean energy cycle and calculating different terms. So G stands for generation, and then C stands for conversion or exchange. So you have different kinetic energy and available potential energy fields. So you have the mean field, which is time averaged, and on top of that you have the turbulent fields that are generally eddy generated. And in particular, for this talk, we will focus on this mean and turbulent exchange between the kinetic energy and APE. So, and in addition to that, we will focus on this dissipation of available potential energy, which is the so-called irreversible mixing. And the reason we're interested in irreversible mixing is that that is the mixing that is not well, irreversible, so to speak, but it's basically the fluid that goes up or down through irreversible mixing is not coming back. So that's in contrast with this. So the vertical buoyancy flux can go either way, and this is all essentially lost to the background potential energy. The way we calculate available potential energy is by obtaining minimal potential energy state. So we take our domain, we resort all fluid parcels, so we stack them from the bottom up in the decreasing order of density, so you have densest fluid on the bottom. And then that generates this kind of curve. So you have buoyancy, and then you have this parameter z star. So basically, if you take a particular buoyancy, parcel of a particular buoyancy in a resorted minimal density field, it will end up at this height. And so then using these parameters, you can calculate the background potential energy, which is just regular potential energy, but instead of z, you have z star. And then available potential energy is the difference between all total potential energy and the background potential energy. For our simulations, we are using just regular Navier-Stokes equations with Boussinesq approximation. And we also have a rotation in our model since we are simulating an Earth system. And for the Boussinesq approximation, we're basically not normalizing density by this rho naught, which in the ocean you usually take to either 1,000 kilograms per meter cubed or 10,025. But what that does is it scales buoyancy to be between 0 and 1. And for our code, I have been using SOMAR, which is Stratified Ocean Model with Adaptive Refinement. It is a code that has been developed by a former grad student in our lab, and it allows for adaptive mesh refinement for cells that have either large buoyancy or large velocity gradients. And you can turn that on and off, and on top of that, it has also adaptive time stepping. So you can also satisfy CFL condition even if you don't turn in adaptive mesh refinement. And this is the setup for my model. I have 5 different cases. My basic case, it has only buoyancy, so forcing at the surface. And this is, so you have heavier fluid in red on this side, which is the pole, and then it decreases towards this mid-latitude region. Because I'm looking at the Southern Ocean, it's periodic or zonal flow in the x direction, and then I have solid boundaries elsewhere. And the rotation is consistent with Southern Hemisphere. And then in case of the wind forcing, I have both the easterlies in the lower part of the domain, and then I have westerlies in the upper part of the domain. And I took my buoyancy forcing by looking at ECHO, which is MIT GCM model output, which actually synthesizes different satellite measurements. So I best fitted a function to obtain a buoyancy forcing at the surface. And then I am looking at 4 different types of wind forcings, which are plotted here as a function of latitude. So the very first one, WF1, has very, very small symmetric wind forcing. Then WF2 is 10 times WF1, but it's still symmetric sinusoidal forcing. Then WF3, which is plotted in this purple line, is a Fourier fit to the actual wind stress at the ocean surface. And then WF4 is the twice, so double WF3. And the reason I'm looking at all these is, first, I want to look at the effects that wind stress magnitude has on the types of mixing and energy budget, but also I want to look at what kind of effect the shape of the wind stress has on that as well. So by comparing this sinusoidal symmetric wind stress profile with this real, more asymmetric wind profile where the easterlies are a lot less in magnitude than the westerlies. And why I'm using this on blue waters, so in general, large-scale ocean models don't really resolve mixing. One of the best available long-time models right now has been MIT GCM, but it only has 18 by 18 kilometer resolution, so we have to compute mixing as a residual from steady state. And for DNS models in general, it is really difficult to resolve actual ocean model as well because of the large aspect ratios and also really large Rayleigh numbers. And the computational capabilities on blue waters allow that we have fine resolution. So my base grid has 512 by 1024 by 128 grid points, but then on top of that, I have adaptive mesh refinement. So it refines at least in 4 cells with high velocity gradients. And also, these kind of simulations require really long runtime because you have to take small steps due to high velocities, and also you need at least 100,000 plus time steps to converge to any sort of steady state or quasi-steady state. Now I will show you some results. So these plots show the so-called overturning stream functions. So you can think of it as this is in YZ, so this is depth, and this is latitude. So this is south, this is north, and in red, it's the flow going towards the mid-latitudes, so going northward, and then in blue, it's the flow going southward. And this is flow along isopycnal lines. So this is the buoyancy forcing only case, and this goes in increasing amount of wind forcing. So what I found interesting is that first, as you increase wind stress, you actually end up with these, rather than one large circulating cell, which a lot of people have seen in just regular horizontal convection, you end up with these 2 recirculating cells. But what's also interesting is that you end up with this smaller recirculating cell at the top near mid-latitudes, which is something similar that we actually see from large-scale ocean models as well. Now if you look at the shape, how the effect that the shape has on this overturning stream function. So this is the more ocean realistic wind forcing case, and this is the symmetric wind forcing case. When you actually have the non-symmetric wind forcing, you end up with this more of a one-cell circulatory model, which is if you think of the ocean, this is where you have formation of the dense water, and then it sinks and travels towards the equator, and then you have waters from the equator going towards the pole, which is how it is in the real ocean. But you still see that as you increase, if you compare WF3 and WF4, as you increase the wind forcing, you're creating a stronger recirculating cell at the surface near this near the equator and at mid-latitudes. So now just looking at the terms on the energy cycle, and I will walk you through all of these, and the output for each simulation is color-coded. First, we can look at the generation of kinetic energy just to make sure that our model is doing what we expected it to. So buoyancy forcing case, you have no generation of kinetic energy. You have very small generation of kinetic energy for WF1. Then you have about an order of magnitude greater kinetic energy generation for WF2. Then WF2 and WF3 have more or less comparable kinetic energy generation, and then WF4 has twice WF3, which is what we would expect based from our surface forcing conditions. Then we can look at the vertical buoyancy flux, and in particular, what we see is that it is more or less balanced. So whatever is going from the mean kinetic energy field is into the APE field is then actually going back into the eddies. And so there's this balance, which is one of the, I guess, one of the ideas in oceanography is that this exchange is largely wind-driven, so you have mean wind circulation driving the kinetic energy going into the AP field, and then it's going back into the kinetic energy field and being dissipated by eddies. So what that gives us is that if these two terms are balanced, then we can predict this irreversible mixing, so the dissipation of APE, just based on this surface generation term, which is great because that means that we can calculate, instead of going and calculating all of this ocean energy budget, we can actually just calculate the generation term and predict how much of the irreversible mixing you're going to have in the ocean. And so in general, this is really great. Like if you want to think about real ocean, and it's a lot easier to obtain all these surface terms from satellite information and actual measurements than going and having to calculate all 3D information for velocities and densities and everything else all throughout the ocean at all depth. And just really quickly to show that it is indeed wind-driven. So this is the vertical buoyancy flux, the mean component, and so red is the production of, so conversion of kinetic energy into APE. And so that corresponds with where the fluid is going upward. So this is Ekman vertical velocities, which is the wind-driven velocity at the surface. And in regions where it's positive are also the regions where the vertical buoyancy flux is largely positive. So that's the upwelling of lighter fluid. And then here you have, in this region, you have lowering of the dense fluid. So that's the decrease in APE. And similarly here you have upwelling of the dense fluid. So, and all of that, if you look at now the turbulent component, it is largely negative, which is partially what we see in the ocean, but it balances the eddies in this turbulent field are balancing the production of AP in the mean field. Now, to the conclusions, what we have seen through this project is that greater wind stress creates a recirculating cell at mid-latitudes, which is one of the features, if you look at ocean models, is what we're getting. Wind stress profile matters, which I'm not sure if a lot of DNS studies have looked at that, but it really, symmetric profile actually breaks down the connectivity between the polar and mid-latitude cells. So if you want to capture ocean dynamics, you actually have to have an asymmetric profile where westerlies are stronger than easterlies. And addition of wind stress shifts energy cycle, so you're getting balance between mean and turbulent vertical buoyancy flux, where mean flow is largely driven by the wind, and you're also getting balance between surface AP generation and irreversible mixing, which is how so you can predict the value of irreversible mixing. And for future work, I have been running some simulations with rough bottom topography, so one of the criticism of just using DNS has been that it doesn't really generate any internal waves, and hopefully having rough bottom topography will lead to generation of internal waves, and we can also quantify how much that has impact as compared to just wind forcing at the surface. So I will take any questions.